Good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. Welcome to the 600 plus participants registered to attend this important webinar discussion on resource mobilization for biodiversity. On behalf of the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework EU Support Project, I'm very pleased to be opening this key discussion ahead of SBI3 and of next steps of the process toward the COP15 in Kunming. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank all the panelists who will contribute to this webinar, as well as the Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the co-chairs of the Global Biodiversity Framework negotiation process. I hope it will bring a mindful contribution and help shape the ambitious post-2020 biodiversity framework we all need. Just a few technical points. A live interpretation is available in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish, under the globe button on the bottom of your screen. To only hear the interpret language, click on mute original audio. Please submit the questions you want to raise to the panelists through the question and answer section only, in English, French, or Spanish. The points made in the chat space will only support the discussion among participants. The webinar is recorded and the video will be made available together with the panelists' presentation on our project website tomorrow. A follow-up email, including a link to the video, a summary article, and a feedback survey form to complete, will be shared to all participants also tomorrow. If you experience any technical difficulty, please reach out bilaterally through the chat to the technical support, Jules Bismuth. He will be happy to provide you with guidance as needed. Without further ado, I turn the floor over to Onno van Heuvel from UNDP Biofin. We will moderate this webinar, and to David Cooper for a few words of introduction on behalf of the Executive Secretary of the CBD. Good virtual meeting and good real exchanges to all. Dear Onno, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, DJ, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or perhaps even good night, depending on where you all are. Welcome to this webinar. Let me just run you through the agenda briefly. So this webinar consists of 2 major parts. So after this initial introduction, we're going to have a brief discussion with 3 panelists that will last about 1 hour. We're going to have 3 presentations of 10 minutes each, followed by discussions and question and answer. Those presentations will focus a bit more on the landscape level, the status of biodiversity finance in the world, and highlighting some of the most promising mechanisms that we have observed so far or that hold promise for the future. Then we move to the second part, where we move a bit more down to the practical level, hearing from 3 speakers again that each have a presentation of 10 minutes each, followed by questions, answers, and discussion. And this second part will focus a bit more on the private and finance sector, showing some insights from what's happening on the ground. After that, the meeting will be wrapped up by Ines Verleijen and Basile van Havre with some insights into what's next for us. So that's just a brief introduction on the agenda. And with that, I would like to hand over to David Cooper for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Onno, and thank you, Didier, and all the organizers of this very timely and important webinar. It's a real pleasure to join you to say a few words at the opening of this webinar on behalf of Elizabeth Marema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Of course, I think we all understand that resource mobilization will be key to the successful implementation of a robust and ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework that is due to be adopted at COP15 in Kunming. The I think we also all know that the evidence is clear that the loss of species, degradation, loss and fragmentation of ecosystems is jeopardizing progress to the SDGs. And the current pandemic is perhaps a stark manifestation of that. And this is concerning not only scientists and ecologists, but also economists. And as Professor Dasgupta indicated in his recent review, we're undermining nature, and the consequences on our societies and economies globally are huge. So we're looking forward for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, just as the Paris Climate Agreement did for climate change, to galvanize action, to mobilize the world to protect and restore nature, to help achieve the SDGs, also contribute to the fight against climate change, and provide jobs and economic prosperity. The framework will serve as an umbrella strategy for governments at all levels, for businesses, public and private finance, civil society, to provide coherent guidance and support to conserve, restore, sustainably use biodiversity. You'll see that the framework in its current revised draft recognizes that urgent policy action globally, regionally and nationally is required to transform economic, social and financial models so that the trends that have exacerbated biodiversity loss will be reduced over the decade to 2030, and that we can put nature on a path of recovery to achieve the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Now, implementation of this framework will for sure require an unprecedented mobilization of financial resources from all sources to support development of capacity. We'll also need the mainstreaming of biodiversity across economic sectors. And this means that everyone, public and in the public sector and the private sector, will need to be involved. You'll know that COP14 provided a mandate in preparing for how the resource mobilization issue would be integrated into the post-2020 framework. And in line with the COP14 mandate, we engaged a panel of experts on resource mobilization last year. And in their report, they proposed a strategic approach with three main elements. Firstly, reducing and redirecting resources that are currently causing harm to biodiversity. We're currently spending far more on harming biodiversity than on conserving it and using it sustainably. Secondly, on generating additional resources from all sources. And thirdly, on enhancing the effectiveness and efficiency of the use of resources. They also encouraged the development of national biodiversity finance plans, and I'd like to salute UNDP's BioFin initiative and their support to many countries in this regard. In each of these three critical areas, the public and private financial sector have a key role to play in leveraging the transformation of economic sectors and by financing a biodiversity positive economy. And they can do this through a number of channels by managing the risks, dependencies, and impacts of their investments on biodiversity, by mobilizing funding for a pro-nature economy, by helping public policies to create an enabling environment to attract private funding, by leveraging investments in nature-based solutions. And an important foundation for this is also disclosing risks and impacts on nature. And the future task force on nature-related financial disclosures will have an important role in this respect. But these developments by the finance sector will also need to be supported by enabling environments and appropriate action, policies, regulations, incentives from governments. as well as the development of adequate financial mechanisms that reduce financial risks and help to provide returns and promote positive impacts on biodiversity. And the framework, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, will be very important in this respect. It needs to help to send clear signals, coupled with clear and precise transition pathways to move forward. And defining these will be an important part of the work of the convention as we go forward. To support this, the CBD Secretariat is engaging actively with the financial sector. I'd like to thank you all for your active engagement, and I look forward to continuing our work together in the coming months. Your discussions today on these topics will be very useful and in helping us to move forward in this regard. I wish you all a very productive workshop. And again, thank you. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to all of those involved in this important webinar today. Back to you, Onno.
Thank you so much, David. And I think you've set the scene very well by framing the discussions that we have on the table today. We need unprecedented resource mobilization, and we need a comprehensive approach by not only looking at the biodiversity positive investments, but also especially reducing the ones that have potential negative impact. So thank you so much for that contribution. I think we'll now move to the first part of the discussion. And I would like to announce our first speaker, Rose Neo. She's the Chief Conservation Officer at the Paulson Institute. And I think, as many of you know, they recently published their report, Financing Nature, Closing the Biodiversity Finance Gap. And she will share some of the most important insights from this report. Rose, over to you.
Thank you, Onno. Can you see the screen?
We can see it now. Yes, thank you.
Is it full screen?
It is now, thanks.
Is it a full screen for you?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer and sponsor of this event for inviting me to join this very important discussion. To support CBD COP15 and its preparation process, my organization, the Paulson Institute, initiated a research project named Financing Nature, Closing the Global Biodiversity Financing Gap about 2 years ago. In partnership with the Nature Conservancy and Cornell University, we launched our research report in September last year. If you are interested in reading the full report, you can download it from the websites of our institutions.
Rose, sorry to briefly interrupt you, but I'm just reading that participants can still not see the full screen, to see your presenter screen. So if you could just,
okay.
Yeah. Thanks, now it's working, perfect.
Okay, thank you, I'm sorry. So first, I'd like to share the 5 key insights of our report. We believe the only way to slow and stop global biodiversity loss is to ensure that nature is appropriately valued in all economies and across all sectors. The global biodiversity financing gap is large, but can be closed for less than 1% of global annual GDP. A lot of attention has been on what the private sector can do or how much ODA funding can be raised in the CBD negotiations. We believe that private companies and investors have the potential to play a very important and huge role, but the most impactful actions to unlock both public and private financial flows are through reforming policies and improving regulatory frameworks by national governments. And lastly, increasing ODA alone will not close the financing gap. We estimate annual financial flow towards biodiversity is at the range of $124 to $143 billion per year as of 2019, which is only 0.12% to 0.14% of annual global GDP. Currently, majority of the funding comes from public sector, and domestic budget and fiscal policy of governments alone represent 54% to 60% of the total annual flows. A key finding of our research is that total annual subsidies to agriculture, fishery, and forestry, which are potentially harmful to biodiversity, is between 274 and 542 billion US dollar. This harmful spending is 2 to 4 times larger than current total financing flow into biodiversity conservation. Therefore, we believe reducing and redirecting those harmful subsidies should be at the top of the action list for all countries. Our research organized estimation of global biodiversity funding needs into 3 components, namely biodiversity conservation through terrestrial and marine protected areas, sustainably managing productive landscapes and seascapes, and biodiversity conservation in peri-urban areas and reducing water pollution. This number, which ranges between 722 and 967 billion US dollar per year, is the basis for us to determine the annual financing gap. This graph shows the total biodiversity financing gap, represented by the pink box in the center. The gap is around 711 billion US dollar per year. While this amount seems very large, it's actually comparable to the total climate commitment of nearly 600 billion US dollar per year. For context, this amount is less than the amount the world spent on soft drink in a year. This slide is important as it demonstrates the biggest area of financing and economic policies needed to close the biodiversity financing gap. The 7 areas shown in green color include biodiversity offset, natural infrastructure, green financial products, domestic budget and tax policy, nature-based solution and carbon markets, ODA, and sustainable supply chains. If can be scaled up, they will produce billions of dollars in new revenue for biodiversity conservation. However, it's important to highlight that this financing gap will not be closed unless all countries take significant efforts to scale up the reform of subsidies harmful to biodiversity and improve investment risk management practices by the financial sector. Shown on the slide in red color represent nearly half of the total biodiversity financing gap. Our report proposes a set of resource mobilization goals and targets for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. In global level, parties should collectively close the financing gap by 2030 by both increasing funding from all sources and reducing harmful subsidies and investment in all sectors. International development aids, or ODA, for biodiversity should at least double by 2025 to cover the cost of developing countries to develop their national biodiversity strategy and action plans and national biodiversity finance plans. I'd like to highlight that even if doubled, ODA and donor funding cannot close even 10% of the total global financing gap. Therefore, it's very important for all parties complete their national biodiversity finance plans by 2024, and all countries raise the needed funds and establish incentive policies and regulatory frameworks by 2030. This slide provides some additional details on how we can achieve the 2 global goals and 2 national targets. One key suggestion here is that Global Environment Facility, GEF, should increase the resources available for the biodiversity focal areas to support countries with the implementation of national biodiversity finance plans and prioritize funding for domestic policy and physical reforms rather than discrete field projects. Bilateral and multilateral banks should prioritize the capacity building for domestic policy reforms and covering sectorial transition costs. Lastly, we believe that the resource mobilization strategy must be tightly linked with the mainstreaming agenda, particularly in 3 sectors, namely agriculture, infrastructure, and financial service. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose. And it's great to see that this is not just a very important analytical report, but you have very practical and urgent recommendations for countries to follow. And I also found it's very insightful that the biggest finance needs are actually related to croplands, that where the financial needs are even bigger than protected areas. So I'm sure that's something we all take home. So it's clear we have to look at agriculture in terms of mainstreaming and financing. And therefore, I think it's great to hear next from the World Bank. I'm happy to introduce Giovanni Ruta, Senior Environmental Economist at the World Bank, who are working at the finance sector in a number of countries and also produced an important report looking at how the private sector can contribute to biodiversity finance. Giovanni, over to you.
Thank you, Onno, and hello, everyone. It's incredible. I'm talking to an audience of 250 plus people from my home. So let me share my screen, and please let me know if it's not coming across. So I work at the World Bank as environmental economist and coordinating our work in the lead up to COP15 in Kunming. So I'll present you a little bit of the ideas we've been coming forth with our colleagues from IFC and the finance unit. We published in September this publication that Onno kindly just referred to on mobilizing private finance, where we identify 5 big ideas to keep in sync with the big 5 we all know from biodiversity. And the first big step is, as Rose was mentioning, is environmental fiscal reform to sort of level the playing field by removing perverse subsidies. The second thing is we need to understand what is the impact we're having on the environment, how is that impact also affecting the economy. That's national data provision is important. And then we need to help financial institutions with the mechanisms that allow them to disclose on nature-related non-financial disclosures that are necessary then to really get on a better track. Then, of course, change requires time, requires experience, requires piloting, and looking at the top 100 companies that have a bearing on biodiversity and ecosystem services in a similar way as it's done in climate change is an important strategy. And finally, because of the testing that is really required to get these ideas going forward, is providing catalytic capital to start playing with these ideas. So this is the central framework of our logic. And on the vertical axis, you don't need to read every word in this table. Just focus on the structure of it. On the vertical axis, you see biodiversity and ecosystem services impact. The more you go up, the more the positive the impact. And so at the bottom, you have all those activities that have negative impacts on biodiversity. On the horizontal axis, you see the economic return from an activity. So basically, this is the space of economic activity seen in 2 dimensions, the dimension of environmental impact and the dimension of economic return. So most of our, what we call financing for biodiversity is really, taking all those projects that are on the top left corner of the table. So we know have a positive impact on nature. That's why we want to finance them, but they don't necessarily have positive returns. Very often we finance them at a loss, and we use grant money for this activity. So what we want to do is to mobilize the resources that allows us and mobilize the technology that allows us to make an economic return out of the activity. That's what we call financing green. The second big item in the resource mobilization field is how do we move those projects that have high economic returns, think of your mining project or your soy plantation or palm oil plantation, and make it more biodiversity friendly. So that's what we call green in finance. And it sort of speaks to the categories that David very nicely presented in his nice introduction. So I will be focusing the next few minutes on this part of the game, the game of green in finance, because it really involves large amounts of investment. It could have really large amount of impact. So why, if you are in the finance sector, why should you worry about this thing? Why would you want to green your finance and reduce the impact? Well, recent economic analysis we have conducted looks at the cost of inaction for the global economy when you don't take care of ecosystem services. These figures are out of the oven. They are featured in the Dasgupta review. And the left side figure looks at 3 tipping points, namely the collapse in forestry service in terms of timber production, the collapse of fisheries, and the collapse of pollination. So if these type of tipping points are reached, when sort of the system doesn't allow to sustain the production of the services that are valuable to the economy, then what we see is that the world will miss out between 2021 and 2030 about 10% of the predicted growth for the world going forward in the next decade. So there is a lot at stake, and this is sort of a stress test for the global economy. What happens if we hit these tipping points, and we see what happens to the economy? Now, the worrying part of that is that in the right-hand side of the chart, you see that the distribution of those impacts is actually such that it affects low-income countries the most. So low-income countries lose up to 30% of their growth in the next decade if these tipping points are reached. So once you know that the impacts are material, then how do you help the finance sector? And the Dutch central bank, DNB, has done very nice first contribution to this agenda by looking at 3 categories of risk: biodiversity risk in terms of physical impact, but also transition risk and reputation risk. These risks transmit to the economy, and through the economy, they can affect either the production of firms or the reputation. So they really affect the bottom line of economies, and they can impact the financial sector, of course. And if the financial sector starts losing, they are able to give less credit to companies, and those sort of that becomes a circular problem and becomes systemic, as I was saying. So what we're doing is at the bank is we're really supporting, starting to think of supporting some countries really take these ideas forward. And for example, we are in dialogue with the Central Bank of Brazil. And as you know, Brazil is one of the mega biodiverse countries in the world. 15 to 20% of the world biodiversity is there, 6 huge terrestrial biomes, 3 large marine ecosystems. And the central bank starts seeing that, indeed, this risk can be risk for the financial sector. For example, between 2015 and 2019, Brazilian bank invested in $60 billion in foreign risk commodity companies, including beef, soy, pulp and paper, and palm oil. So these of course, are risks potentially down the line for the banking system in Brazil. But there is also opportunities. With the financing gap for the NDC, the climate change NDC, we know that nature can provide some of the climate change mitigation opportunities. So you see there also an opportunity for the financial sector to capture some of the climate money and invest into this. And this is compatible with the recent agenda by the central bank to democratize the finance in Brazil, the Agenda BC. It has 5 principles: inclusion, competitiveness, transparency, education, and sustainability. And the idea under sustainability is really to scale up the effort on social and environmental standards in the banking system, and also incorporate sustainability better in the Brazilian decision-making process. The second country we are starting to support, dialogue is really more incipient here, is Malaysia. The Bank Negara Malaysia has an interest in particularly to understand what are the risks that its financial sector is facing on biodiversity and nature services, and how, what type of data information is required to manage such risks, and how then to help the financial institutions and the companies measure such risks. This is again compatible with the vision the government is putting forth. The National Policy on Biodiversity was issued in 2015, 2016. There is obligations, of course, under the SDGs, but also coming up with the post-2020 framework in the context of the CBD. And finally, there is an interim working group that is being established in Malaysia. Is a platform for business and biodiversity. So the central bank really needs to build its capacity to deal with these issues going forward. So my final slide is a key gap that we need to fill to make this happen really at scale in as many countries as possible is the data gap. The concept of double materiality is crucial. It's the idea that not only a company affects ecosystem services and biodiversity, but the impact on ecosystem services and biodiversity can also impact the company and the financial sector. So we need to measure across these two sides of the materiality problem. There is top-down approaches, so natural capital accounting that allow to look at things at the macro level, sort of the stress test numbers I showed in my early slides. It's that type of information is really important because you want to look at the system and how it behaves. But at the same time, you need to collect information from the bottom up. You want to really liaise with companies and financial institutions to collect their information, what they know, and that's why the role of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure is really crucial because it helps sort of establish the standards for that type of information generation, use, and sharing. I'll stop there. Thank you all, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. And it's really interesting to see how the finance sector is increasingly taking biodiversity and nature seriously, not something anymore that we may want to do, but something that we must do. And I think we're going to hear more on that from our next speaker, Gilles Kleijs. He's the director of the Ecological Transition and Natural Resources Department of the AFD, and he's going to share some insights from his work, as well as from a recent publication called The Little Book on Investing in Nature. I just want to remind everybody that all your questions, please put them in the question and answer box. I'm going to select some of them to pose to the panelists later. Gilles, over to you.
Thank you, Uno, and thank you to the organizer, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to share some thoughts today. I think today, in the midst of a deep crisis that is directly linked to biodiversity erosion, and the IMF has just costed a few days ago the cost of the COVID crisis to $28 trillion of economic losses in the next 5 years. We really have to remind ourselves that this kind of situation is an opportunity here to draw lessons, and especially to ensure that our activity as humans is steered within the ecological limits of our planet. So mobilizing resources and efforts for biodiversity in this context and at this scale is really the issue today. The last resource mobilization dialogue at SBI3, the informal dialogues, focused strongly on ODA. And as we've seen the figures, this is really only a small portion of the global solutions that are needed to green our activities and boost our efforts globally in favor of biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and equitable sharing of benefits. To put it very shortly, maybe the solution, is 10%, 15% in really increasing ODA and really increasing conservation finance. But 80% of the problem is mostly about greening our economy. How do we tackle that? The point I want to make here in this conjecture, to find a solution to both raise ODA, raise strongly conservation money, but especially green or entire economy, is the importance of aligning all financial flows to biodiversity. This is the only way, I think, to resolve this deep contradiction and deep sort of financial gap that we are facing for biodiversity. So in this remark, I'm really convinced that rather than concentrating our efforts mostly on conservation finance and on ODA, the only reasonable way to fill the resource mobilization gap for biodiversity is really to strongly and more reliably make all financial flows biodiversity positive. Obviously, including the post-COVID recovery packages and their trillions, basically, that they mobilize, and including as well the reorientation of the $500 billion of yearly negative public spendings. To accelerate this, my point is that as well, public financial institutions, be they ministers of finance and their public budgets, national central banks, bilateral and multilateral public development banks, have a key role to play in this alignment of financial flows to biodiversity, and a key role, important role in the coming months to prepare for COP15 and its global biodiversity framework. Why is that so? Because public spendings altogether represent about 35 trillions per year, roughly half of the global GDP. And it makes the financial gap for biodiversity look manageable, which we think it is. And the public sector is key as well because they create norms and standards for best practices that can help and steer private investments. Because as well, they bring a political objective, i.e. social and environmental. And because as well, it's public budgets and public financial institutions and policies that are really at the crux of the contradiction, as shown by the previous speakers and shown by the little book on investing in nature, that basically every $1 of public money that is spent to conserve biodiversity is matched by $4, $5, $6 public dollars that supports activity that destroy biodiversity. And as well, public institutions are key because they already have an experience of aligning with environmental sector and especially with the Paris Agreement. So if we want to align all financial flows to biodiversity, how can we start this gigantic revolution of ensuring that all these flows worldwide and nationally become biodiversity positive? Well, I think actually the good news, as we are seeing in the last 5 or even a bit more years, is that this revolution has already started, and with quite a bang, I must say. And there is a profusion at the moment of very interesting and promising initiatives. To name a few, beyond equator principles, beyond the European taxonomy on activities that are detrimental to the environment, we are seeing now really specific pledges. For example, Finance for Biodiversity pledge with 37 major private financial banks and financial institutions that have pledged to really align their finance to biodiversity, and especially measure, for example, the impact of everything they finance on biodiversity. There is as well a Paris collaborative group on green budgeting that brings together central banks that are interested in this, in aligning their finance to biodiversity. There's obviously, as you've seen, a pledge by all public development banks, 450 establishments in the world, the latest Finance in Common Summit in November, on adopting biodiversity strategies and their full toolbox. There's already the TNFD, as we have said, the task force. There's a coalition on climate and biodiversity finance. There is the move by the World Bank group on green, resilient, inclusive development, and all what our colleague Jenny has just said. So this thrust really is important. And the point I want to make here is that within this big effort, working specifically with public development banks that channel a lot of ODA especially, they are worth altogether 2.3 trillions of investment per year. That's 10% of all global investment. I think working with them on biodiversity and resource mobilization is key, and they must really be part of preparing the GBF, because their mandate, most importantly, is given by the same governments that are going to sign in Kunming a possible agreement on biodiversity. And again, quite a few of them, including the French Development Agency, but not alone, are already full with experience in how to align with environmental agenda, such as the Paris Agreement. And this, a lot of lessons can be learned for biodiversity aligning. Just very briefly, what do we mean actually by aligning finance to biodiversity? Well, the principles are quite simple, and we are going to look today at a lot of the tools that can be used, but it's really ensuring that your finance does not harm biodiversity. There's the offsetting hierarchy, there are exclusion lists, there are already a number of key standards around the world that need to be improved, both in the text and in their implementation. The key other element is obviously strengthening the financing of biodiversity positive activities, such as nature-based solutions, green and blue infrastructure, ecosystem-based adaptation, agroecology, certified value chains, etc. And this mainstreaming activity is possible. And for example, again, at the French Development Agency, we have actually put a figure, and we can move from $500 million of biodiversity finance to 1 billion in the next 5 years if we really push these nature-based solutions. One of the third element as well of aligning is really tracking precisely your biodiversity efforts and your biodiversity footprints. And there's a lot of tools now that are available to do that. So it is perfectly feasible. A fourth key issue of aligning is ensuring that your positive public finance, is steering and de-risking private finance into a blended activity for nature positive activities. And again, there are quite a few examples that this is actually working. A fifth element or a sixth element is really about risk. And we have already talked today of the key issue of better taking into account systemic risk, but as well the risk that your counterparts, that as a financer you are financing, are taking if they're not careful of biodiversity degradation. And again, I think a good idea is as well to piggyback in a way on climate finance. I think there's a lot of virtue in bringing together climate and biodiversity finance. To do all this, all these key elements in the right places at the right scale, as we were saying, what does it take to do this? And I think the key issue here I want to convey for this workshop as well, and that it is really about you, both conservation community and the finance community, of coming, convening together, listening more carefully to each other and finding common solutions. And when you look at opportunities to do this, they have been too rare so far. And I'm very glad that these arenas, bringing the two communities together, are getting more and more frequent. Basically, I think public development banks as well is one of these arenas where you have conservationists like myself working closely with finance people to find solutions. So I think with all our support, your support, with other private and public finance institutions, we might really bring some hope to this difficult equation in our time of unprecedented crisis, of both increasing ODA for biodiversity, increasing conservation budgets, and we've seen they must, move from about 60 to 70 billion to about 160 billion per year, but mostly as well financing the cost of transition to a biodiversity positive economy, estimated at 500 to 600 billion per year, as well within a low carbon and inclusive economy. Again, and to finish on this, as was said before, this roughly, this objective, 800 to 900 altogether billion US dollars, roughly corresponds to 1% of the global GDP. While we, as humanity are currently spending roughly 0.15 to 2.2% of our GDP in helping sustain life on Earth. So I just want everybody to try to imagine what this means. 0.2% of the global GDP. I mean, if this were a rent, for example, to maintain our house on, our house Earth, which in a way biodiversity conservation is, this would mean that, for example, with an income of $1,000 per month, we would spend only $2 to pay our landlords, while nature is actually providing roughly the basis for half of our GDP. So it just can't work. So we really have to multiply our efforts by at least 5. And the only way really to do that is to align financial flows as they have a biodiversity positive impact, all of these flows. And I think public spendings and ODA have a specifically strong role to play in this alignment. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Gilles, and also for convincing us that biodiversity is a bargain. It doesn't cost that much and gives a lot. I think that's a message that should resonate with governments. And also it's really inspiring to see how development banks, perhaps they were not sort of the first generation conservationists, are now stepping up and becoming actually pioneers in biodiversity finance, looking at both sides of the coin, reducing the negative expenditures and promoting a pipeline of biodiversity positive investments. So it's really great to see. So thank you all for listening. If you have any more questions, you're still welcome to share them in our Q&A box. Please don't put them in the chat. And now we're going to move to some additional discussion. So we have a additional question for each panel member, and then we're going to move to your questions. So let me get straight into it. I'm just going to start with Rose. Rose, actually, the report you presented talks about a lot of mechanisms having promise. It would be great if you can elaborate on one of them. And we just noted there was also a question actually in the question box on biodiversity offset. So if you could pick that one, that would be wonderful. Can you just explain us a bit what that means and why we could consider that as a biodiversity positive investment, while it actually presents a compensation for a negative impact? So great if you can enlighten us a bit more about that. Thank you, Rose.
Thank you, Ono. So our report actually proposed 9 different financing mechanisms and policies. 7 are the ones, increase the positive flow for biodiversity, and 2 reduce the future need for the biodiversity conservation and restoration. We found out biodiversity offset has the biggest potential for increasing a lot of revenues for biodiversity conservation, because if national governments set up the national policy and legislation requesting all those economic activities from all sectors to offset the impact of their activities on nature, then it will reduce a lot of damage to the nature. On one hand, and on the other hand, also those companies who already made avoidable damage need to pay for the damage they created. So that will create cash flow to biodiversity conservation. And I understand that many countries do not have legal legislations to make this mechanism working. So first step is national governments and legislative bodies need to create those enabling conditions to allow biodiversity offset working. Yeah, if I'm allowed to only mention one mechanism, I will work on this. I will mention this biodiversity offset. Oh no.
Thank you, and we may get back to you for a second mechanism if time allows. And I think, yeah, biodiversity offset is a kind of complex mechanism, being a system of compensation. But I think from what I've seen in countries around the world, is actually also a lot of countries, they do have this mechanism, but they're not actually raising the money. So I think that's also one sort of entry point to help improve existing systems of biodiversity offset. And of course, most of all, this can only work if we do follow, as was mentioned before, the mitigation hierarchy. So thank you, Rose. We're going to move now to Giovanni. So you presented some really exciting work with national banks, with central banks in Brazil and Malaysia. So there's a lot of innovative stuff happening in biodiversity financing. What do you think can be done in particular to reduce the so-called negative expenditures or perverse incentives from your point of view? Can you give us some ideas?
Thank you, Onno. So the debate about perverse incentive is well justified because they are, from an economist, in the language of economists, they are inefficient. When you allow an externality to propagate, basically you're making society worse off. So if you don't address that, then you are in a problem. Now, as we approach the issue of addressing perverse incentives, you definitely want to look at subsidies that may increase the conversion of land or overexploitation of certain resources and address that. So as you do that, though, you have to keep in mind that that's not a silver bullet. And it's not a silver bullet for several reasons. Let me mention a couple. First, they are not the only perverse incentive out there. They are perverse incentives, and we know them because we see them, right? We see that there is spending in the budget of the state. This budget recurrently spends on those items, so they are sort of categorized. But there are also perverse incentives that are hidden. We don't see them, but they are very much at play. If you think of tropical deforestation, 30% of it is linked to commodities. So it's your palm oil, your soy, your beef. But other 30% is actually shift in agriculture in very poor settings. And I bet there is not many incentives reaching those poor farmers. What is happening is that there is other incentives, like, for example, the lack of land tenure system, the lack of a proper cadastre. So when people have insecure tenure, they tend to try to secure the asset they have around, and usually that's land. And when they transform it to agriculture, it's very important also factor of biodiversity loss. So that's the agenda of reducing perverse incentives should not only be seen as transforming financial flows, but really also getting the institution down. Now, the second reason why it's not a silver bullet, and it requires a lot of work, is that although we know, and our analysis is showing, we will publish soon an economics report on this, our analysis shows that there is all the big advantage to society to address them, right? But still, even if there is a big advantage, there is winners and losers. And you cannot just argue for removing perverse incentives or reforming incentives without taking that into account, the fact that there is. So you need to be smart, you need to be innovative in terms of how you will address that. And I think there is two key issues, two tools you want to harness. One is the economic analysis. You really to understand where the impacts are larger, where do you want to pick a fight, so to speak, but also see, how you're gonna make it work for the different stakeholders that are involved. So economic analysis can help you a lot with that, and we'll show that in the coming report that was mentioned. The second one is really harness the animal spirits of the private sector. So disclosure requirements, information systems, stacking finance with climate change benefits. We know, climate change agenda is ahead of the nature agenda, and is already developing a strong system. So, for example, integrating nature in the carbon offset schemes or in the carbon market schemes, it's really important. It can help then reach that level in which private sector wants to act. So there is many solutions, and that adds a little bit to the response from Rose on really what is the instruments we are not using that we could use and what is required for that.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for highlighting that with these incentives, we're moving into the political arena, but we're also moving into people's lives. And we have to make sure that the most vulnerable people don't lose out. And I see a link with what you mentioned before about low-income countries bearing the biggest burden on biodiversity loss economically, if it happens. And so we really need an inclusive approach. And thank you so much for propagating that here. We're going to now move to Gilles. Gilles, you already mentioned a little bit about financial public institutions. Can you just elaborate on that and say, how can we engage with this kind of institutions practically to operate this alignment of biodiversity goals in their policies and their finance flows?
Thank you, Ono. I think this is indeed a crucial question. We've seen a thrust in the financial world on taking into account biodiversity in the last 10 years, with a great acceleration in the last 2 or 3 years, and this is really good news. The key issue, I think, for the CBD and for our upcoming global biodiversity framework is how do we tap that? How do we make sure that all this good activity, promising activity, is really mobilized by the agreement that we are going to sign by the end of the year in China? And I think for that, we need targets for sure on ODA. We need targets for sure on increasing resource mobilization at global and national level from all sources. But I think we should need an action-oriented target as well on aligning finance institutions and possibly, at least public institutions, because they are in the realm of the decision of the people who are going to sign the agreement in Kunming. So giving ourselves a target on aligning, for example, public development banks on biodiversity with a number of subsets of targets, including risks, including mainstreaming, including taxonomy, including key objective of risk, tracking, I think is possible and would be really a way to accelerate the thrust of activities that we are already seeing, because then it gives each donor country, each recipient countries, some very practical goals and a roadmap to progressively achieve all these necessary elements of aligning public finance to biodiversity, especially when it comes to their international financing, of course. So I think imagining progressively what could be the shape, the wording, the key practical objectives of such a alignment targets in the global biodiversity framework is probably the most direct and practical way to answer your question, Ono, i.e., to really give a practical, what's the word in English, anchor within the global biodiversity framework for the whole financial community that is really making an important effort on biodiversity at the moment.
Thank you so much, Gilles. And I think if it's one thing that people take away from this discussion is that when you work for an environment industry and you go back home, or in this case, you're maybe already home, please knock on the door of those development banks, central banks, and tell them you are a biodiversity finance stakeholder. It's not just us. You're responsible for so many finance flows in the countries. And I really hope that environment ministries will change their mind to think about these institutes as being critical in any financing strategy. Thank you so much, Gilles, for your insights. And so I just saw that there's a question as well on BioFin and biodiversity finance plans. And I think there's also the biodiversity finance plans are one of the topics discussed under the framework. And so Since I'm working myself for the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, perhaps it's best if I take that one. So just very briefly, the question was, how does this BioFin work and the development of finance plans? So I'm just going to be, of course, very brief here. So what it does is basically a three-step process in countries. First of all, it sort of scans the landscape. What are the existing financing mechanisms in your country that have potential to be improved for your financing strategy? And the second step is then gather important baseline information. How much is the country spending on biodiversity? And how much finance do you need to achieve your national biodiversity goals? And this is done through what we call the BioFin methodology or BioFin workbook. And that sounds like a very rigid methodology, but actually it's more like a kind of pathway that you can follow. And it's more like a do-it-yourself guidebook to create your own methodology based on our lessons that we have seen from 40 countries around the world. So you take this information and then develop your national biodiversity finance plan. And that plan consists of a number of financing solutions or mechanisms. And the way it works is that we have a methodology to sort of screen which ones could have the most potential. I think offsets was mentioned, although there's a lot of discussion ongoing whether we should pursue that or not. There's so many other mechanisms out there, like working on certification, working on trust funds, working on carbon offsets, for example. And so you choose the ones that you think have the biggest potential, just like the policy report did at the global level, and you take those in your finance plan. And then, of course, we don't want to stop there, but also focus on implementation. So that's just very briefly on my work. And I'm just going to look back now at some more emerging questions. I think there's another question for you, Gilles. Your suggestion of making public spending biodiversity positive is well taken. If this were to happen, would this not also simultaneously require significant changes in governance across national governments, which may be a more daunting task? So Gilles, I hope that was clear, and over to you.
I think as a representative of the large community of multilateral and bilateral development banks, we are here to finance national efforts, mostly national efforts with the respect of national sovereignty and national issues. So I think policy dialogue is a big part of this, obviously, but we need to make sure that we provide the right support to whatever national initiatives on policy reforms, and especially of having all government approaches to biodiversity. This is really the new thing. This is really, making sure that biodiversity leaves the realms of the ministries of finance, of environment, to really reach the ministries of finance, the ministries of agriculture, of mining, resources, planning, the Prime Minister's office, the presidential office. This is what we, need to strive for. But this is a question of national sovereignty, and bringing foreign funds, bringing foreign technical assistance, bringing foreign support, shouldn't impede on these national sovereignties. So of course we will encourage, these policy reforms, but we are not necessarily, the best placed actors to do that. I think national mobilization by scientists, civil society, the private sector, the parliamentarians, all across civil society is key to bring about these policy changes that we can happily, support with regard to biodiversity performance of recipient countries. But this is not something we should how do you say, supersede, or that we should really go beyond or mandates. Frankly, we have to respect national sovereignties very carefully on that.
Thanks. Indeed, that should be an important principle of operation, and also important to highlight the engagement of civil society in all those financing mechanisms. And of course, in some it's more important than others. We go into the next question, which is about green recovery and environmental conditionality. It's an open question to all panelists, but I think maybe Giovanni, you could be quite interested to pick it up. Let's see. Do the panelists believe that we can define nature positive criteria for current green recovery plans that were already decided and potentially thematically allocated but not yet used? For example, the conditionality for airplane companies loans that have conditionality on carbon reduction. And there's a second question, and feel free to pick either one of them. Can we potentially build on the EU sustainable finance taxonomy and other examples that can be refined and upscaled at global level? So I think perhaps you can translate it to a more global question, like this kind of taxonomies. Is that something you're looking at at the national level as well, or perhaps even indeed at the global level? So Giovanni, I hope you're in for this one. Yes,
thank you, Ono, and thank you for the green recovery question. I think that was Noah, and the other one on what you just mentioned on taxonomy. So indeed, the two questions are related, and I would answer them in the same way. So in terms of green recovery, what is green recovery? Green recovery is basically public spending at a huge scale, at a generational scale. You know, basically we are borrowing from our children and grandchildren, perhaps, to finance, to give them a functioning economy in exchange by reboosting it, by avoiding that it collapses. So the way to make it green is to have proper safeguards in place. So good for those countries that have them. And moving forward is to really see what the financial flows, where it goes. So the taxonomy is really crucial. And that's what the EU has been doing. That's what the next generation EU tries to do, is to basically adopt that that framework to push for the recovery funds. That's what some countries are doing. So overall progress is, Vivid Economics has come out with estimates of how green have been the first phase of recovery packages, and they haven't been much green across the board. So that means that there's better that can be done. In terms of how, again, this is public money. It's often borrowed by another institution, and that institution could put conditions on the lending. But if it is the market, then we don't have a strong, control mechanism, so to speak. So if a country issues bonds, then it may not have those requirements. So it's an answer with a mixed response. To the extent that there is an institutional framework that is ready to finance this at scale, then yes, I'm quite hopeful there can be, we can give that recovery together with a better planet to our children, which will have to pay for the money. But then it's not always the case. So more work on that area needs to be done.
Thank you. It is an important challenge, how we green recovery measures that already have been decided, but there are some entry points, it's clear. So we're going to do two more questions. So we have one question for Gilles. As you noted, there are dozens of promising standards and tools, but some of the most established, like IMF Performance Standard 6, don't work well yet. Is this a challenge for more new, better standards and tools, or should we more focus on enforcing the standards that we already have? Gilles, over to you for this interesting question.
It's an easy question, actually, because it's one of if you look at the population I know, which is the 450 development banks around the world, which we've done a sort of data and performance analysis, and we have on the website of Finance in Common available to everyone a global picture of the performance, including climate and environmental performance of these banks. The striking point is that only very few have signed to the Equator Principles, and only very few actually mobilize the International Finance Corporation Standard number 6 or any of these standards still. And to be blunt, there is first an issue of adopting these standards and implementing them strongly. And I would say quite honestly that even in a bank where we have a strong political support like at the French Development Agency, there's still room for improvement. So in terms of enforcement, I would say that the big thrust in the coming years, when we speak of aligning public finance and especially ODA to biodiversity, I think better enforcing these standards is key, the IMF standards. And I think reporting on how we enforce these standards is even, is very key, because it's an instrument that has the virtue of basically pushing everyone for better performance. So I think I would say the key part of the answer is enforcement of the existing frameworks. We will, in the coming 10 years, obviously improve these standards. Exclusion lists, we were talking a lot of offsets. Offsets are about what can be offsetted, but there is a big part of biodiversity that cannot be offset. And this lies, on regulations and protections and so on at national level mostly. So I think exclusion lists are as well a key instrument for public finance, alignment on biodiversity. So we will improve standards, but let's first enforce the ones that exist.
Thank you, Gilles. And I hope that government counterparts that are joining from around the world feel empowered to knock on the door of also the international development banks to look in this issue of enforcement of the standards that are already there, which is really indeed crucial. It can be actually important role for environment and as well as finance ministries. And why not include that in your financing strategy? So Rose, I think we have really wanted to get back to you about a second example of a financing mechanism. And I think we just do have the time to do that. So if you're good for it, please, Rose, go ahead and share some more insights into another one of the financing mechanisms that you think has great potential for the coming decade.
Thank you, Ono. I think subsidy reform is a key mechanism, as I mentioned, but it's politically might be difficult. I will not elaborate on that mechanisms. It will take maybe much longer to discuss that. But I will mention that improving investment risk management practice by financial sectors will really have big impact on reducing harm to biodiversity by their investment. We didn't come up with concrete numbers, amount of money that will produce, but we believe it's huge given how banks, financial sectors can mobilize a lot of resources. And I believe that there are a lot of efforts by different groups, including, more data collection, more exposure, and also tours, and have common metrics. If all those tours can be adopted by both public and financial institutions, there is a huge potential to mobilize more biodiversity positive financial resources for biodiversity conservation and restoration. I want to mention that. Thank you, Honor.
Thank you. And it's just echoing once more that the financial sector has to be an important building block of any financing strategy. Just so happens that we are exactly on time for closing this first part. So for those who still had questions, we have to disappoint you here, but please hold them maybe for the next part where they could still be launched. So I would like to thank all three of the panelists. This has been a really interesting discussion, and I think it's hopefully the start of more in the future. It's a discussion that's just starting as the new decade is starting, and there's a lot of work ahead of us. So thank you very much. And for those of you who are hoping for a little break between the first parts, I have to disappoint you. We have a quite tight time schedule, so we're just going to go straight into the second part. So just a reminder, here we're going to hear a bit more from practical examples and practical insights from work being done on the ground. And we have, for those who joined later, again, three interesting panelists. And so we're going to get straight into it, and we're going to actually start with Garrett Phillips, Division Manager for Climate Finance at the African Development Bank. So Garrett, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ono, and thank you for inviting the African Development Bank to join this very important event. Just to protect my bandwidth and sound quality, I'm going to turn my camera off, but I just put it on so that you can see I'm really here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about needs and pathways for green recovery plans, positive for biodiversity. Next slide, please. So as Ono mentioned, I'm the manager of climate and environment finance at the African Development Bank. And so my background comes from the climate change space, and in particular, the role of the Paris Agreement in mobilizing finance for climate change. I'm not a biodiversity expert, but having listened to the previous speakers, particularly Jani and Gilles, it's clear to me that there is much to learn from the climate finance space. So for my intervention today, I'm going to talk briefly on the following topics: the bank's commitment to supporting biodiversity on the continent, some of the links between the African Development Bank priorities and our High-5 development agenda on biodiversity. I'll provide a quick snapshot of some existing biodiversity projects and then talk about what we can learn from COVID-19. And then finally, I'll address how we make recovery plans green and positive for biodiversity and present 4 ways to increase investment for biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So let me start by emphasizing the bank's commitment to supporting biodiversity on the continent. Biodiversity is key to our ability to respond to climate change. Humankind can innovate, but nature evolves and biodiversity is key to that process. So consequently, the status of biodiversity is highly representative of the extent to which we've damaged our environment and upset the complex interactions. And biodiversity, as I'm sure you're aware, is a proxy indicator of many other parameters which are important to the quality of our life. And if we look after biodiversity, then many other things must be in place. So there's no doubt in our minds we need recovery and development plans that are positive for biodiversity. And to reflect this commitment, the 15th replenishment of the African Development Fund, which was completed about 18 months ago, it has a policy commitment on biodiversity, and that is to support African Development Fund countries, which is 38 low-income countries in Africa, to support African Development Fund countries on biodiversity conservation, including restoration of degraded ecosystems and combating desertification by 2022. Now, this shows that the donors to the African Development Fund are aware of the issue of biodiversity. And I think Gilles spoke about this need and this commitment from governments, but frankly, we could do more. Next slide, please. You may have heard of the bank's High-5 development agenda, and that's shown on the left, the 5 sort of headline topics. And there are strong links between these High-5 topics and biodiversity. So for example, when we look at Light Up and Power Africa, we are working to reduce energy dependence of the poorest and fight against desertification. Now, this is important because poor people have no option but to consume the natural capital that surrounds them, and that includes biodiversity. So if we can provide them with access to energy, typically electricity, then we can reduce their impacts upon stored carbon, biodiversity, but also stored carbon and biodiversity. Secondly, on Feed Africa, it specifically includes protection of agricultural genetic diversity to ensure long-term food security. When we look at Industrialize Africa, we can work to reduce pollution and take account of the risks and opportunities linked to biodiversity. And under the heading of Integrate Africa, we work on conservation of cross-border ecosystems and their biodiversity. And for example, in West Africa, we have 28 cross-border basins that cover 71% of the biodiversity. So integrated management across those borders is critical. And finally, when we work to improve the quality of life of African people, then we are increasing support for adaptation and resilience of the local population. And this goes back to my earlier point: if people live in a biodiverse environment, then they are well placed to experience a better quality of life. Next slide, please. The bank has a significant portfolio of biodiversity projects. For example, the Sustainable Management and Conservation of Forests project in Benin. In Madagascar, we're supporting private sector investments in ecotourism in protected area. We have the Lake Chad Biosphere and Heritage projects, which includes early warning systems, income generating activities, and the creation of biosphere reserves. We're working on the Great Green Wall for the Sahel and Sahara Initiative, which will receive in excess of $14 billion of new funding to fast-track restoration of degraded land, save biological diversity, create green jobs, and build resilience for the Sahelian people. And finally, the bank is supporting the shea butter subsector in order to increase incomes, reduce gender and development inequalities, and ensure inclusive growth. And in the process, we will protect the biodiversity and gene pool of the shea butter population. Next slide, please. Of course, we're all highly aware of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on our development agenda. COVID-19 took us all unawares, but it has shone a spotlight on our relationship with nature. COVID-19 has exposed weaknesses in our socioeconomic systems, with significant proportions of the population and the economy very badly affected, whilst others are not affected or have even benefited. In response to the COVID-19 crisis, the bank immediately created a $10 billion COVID response facility to support African governments throughout the crisis. But Africa's ability to adapt to these changes is deeply rooted in its biodiversity, and if we fail to protect and enhance biodiversity, we will lose the ability to adapt. Ladies and gentlemen, we must not let a crisis go to waste. We must use COVID-19 as justification to mainstream biodiversity considerations into our development and recovery plans going forward. Next slide, please. So how do we make recovery plans green and positive for biodiversity? Well, there are 3 steps that we need to take, and these are not new to you. You've already heard them once already this morning. We need to stop any actions that are negative for biodiversity. And in this respect, the African Development Bank applies its integrated safeguard system, which is designed to avoid or mitigate negative environmental and social impacts. Biodiversity is included in this assessment, but we all need to do more, and we need all investors to become increasingly aware of this issue. Secondly, we need to increase actions that are positive for biodiversity. And building here on Gilles' points, I think we can learn a lot from how the Paris Agreement has increased positive actions for climate change. For example, all multilateral development banks have targets to increase climate finance, and the Paris Agreement calls for all finance to be low carbon and climate resilient. Noting the progress that has been made on this to date, DFIs do not yet have targets for biodiversity finance, and I think that that is something that could be brought out through the forthcoming conference of the parties in Kunming. And thirdly, we need to continue to work to raise awareness amongst all investors and regulators of the need for the consideration of biodiversity in development and recovery plans. Next slide, please. Now let's look quickly at 4 ways to increase investment for biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Firstly, valuing natural capital and incorporating biodiversity values into national accounting systems. In other words, making a business case for biodiversity. It's not so easy, and this is something I think that we've been trying for a little bit. And so this is linked to the second point we have about engaging the private sector, and perhaps this is my main takeaway message. Based on our experience with mobilizing private sector investment for climate adaptation, we propose to engage the private sector by paying them for biodiversity rather than relying on grants to public sector bodies. We are developing this approach as a non-market approach under Article 6.8 of the Paris Agreement, and we think it will work very well, for example, for land restoration or subsidizing farmers to maintain local gene pools. But consumers have to pay, and governments need to set up the instruments to facilitate this. And this goes back to the $2 rental example that Gilles mentioned. If governments would put in place mechanisms to collect that sort of finance from consumers, then we could put that to work by paying the private sector to deliver a wide range of biodiversity benefits. We're currently working on that for adaptation benefits under climate change, but we think we could do the same for biodiversity. Thirdly, we need to promote a landscape approach as we do these kinds of projects like the Great Green Wall, the Horn of Africa, and Lake Chad. This means programmatic activities across countries that have artificial boundaries. We need to follow natural and ecosystem-based boundaries. And this also helps to scale up financing. For example, when we go to the Green Climate Fund with a programmatic approach, we can ask for significantly more finance than if we go with just a project-based approach for a given country. And finally, and this is a very specific opportunity for the African Development Bank, we continue to discuss the creation of a Rio Convention Fund within the bank. Such a fund would provide technical assistance for capacity building, awareness raising, enabling environment and project development to access existing funds from the GEF and the GCF. But for this to happen, we need a clear mandate for such a fund from our regional member countries. We need our regional member countries to speak up and say that they want such a fund to be created. Next slide, please. So finally, in conclusion, I think there are no surprises in my concluding points. So let me conclude by confirming that firstly, we're very busy mainstreaming climate change into all of our investment decisions. And likewise, as a publicly owned development institution, we need to mainstream biodiversity into our investment decisions. The best way to make this happen in my institution is through our executive directors at our board. Those executive directors, they come from most of your capitals. So if they tell us to do more, we will. But without that, it's very difficult for us to move in that direction. So the ball really is in the court of the countries that are owners of the African Development Bank, and through their executive directors, they need to tell us that we need to invest more in biodiversity. Let me conclude at this point, and thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Ona.
Thank you so much, Garrett. And I think there's a lot of interesting ideas that you put forward. I think, first of all, I really want to echo what you mentioned about green recovery, is that we should not limit ourselves to recovery, but we have to basically rethink and redesign development with the biodiversity foundation as an important element. And I think also it was really interesting to mention that you have ideas for paying the private sector for biodiversity results, and I can imagine there may be some questions popping up later on, so we may revisit that afterwards. So thank you very much. I would now like to move over to Anas Sharma, the Assistant Vice President for Sustainable Finance and Investor Strategy at India's Yes Bank. Anas, please share some of your insights.
Yes, I'll do that. I'll open my presentation. I hope that's visible. Hello, everyone, and it's indeed a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting Yes Bank to share its perspective at this impactful webinar. I would like to really congratulate the organizers here for convening all the diverse stakeholders and mobilizing dialogue on such critical aspects. Now, before I move forward, I really want to quote a famous saying by David Suzuki, and I quote, "If we pollute the air, water, and soil that keep us alive and well, and destroy the biodiversity, and destroy the biodiversity that allows natural systems to function, I think no amount of money will save us." So I think all of us present here today and all my fellow panelists have really echoed this thought, and we all agree that short-term growth without considerations of climate change, natural capital, biodiversity is vulnerable to boom and bust cycles. And I think my colleagues from World Bank really put it the right way, that any delay in action is going to certainly end up being more costly, right? So another research by United Nations indicates that natural disasters, which are caused by biodiversity loss and climate change, they cost the planet approximately $300 billion annually. And the situation is far more grave in emerging economies like India. I think, again, some of my fellow panelists pointed it out earlier that emerging economies are highly vulnerable to changes in biodiversity patterns and climate change. For instance, 1/3 of India's GDP depends on nature, and another third is dependent on nature to a greater extent, which makes it a humongous 60% of our GDP. When we talk in terms of sectors that are propelling economic growth, be it agriculture, which is like contributing 75% to the workforce in India, be it fisheries, forestry, trade, energy, tourism, they all heavily rely on biodiversity and in turn impact the biodiversity and natural capital of an area as well. And hence, we all believe that there is a strong business case to really adopt a combination of pro-growth and pro-nature policies to advance sustainable development. India, I'm really proud to say, that has displayed exemplary political will when it comes to tackling biodiversity and nature is concerned. This is evident through its ambitious nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, with a very specific focus on creation of carbon sink. Then there are national action plans, there are missions on greening India, there are national forest policies and forestation programs, so on and so forth. So I think it's really important that in order to complement these enabling policies, the financial institutions, or rather the role of financial institutions, must also evolve as sustainability catalysts to really propel this watershed movement forward as far as biodiversity conservation is concerned. First, as engines of growth, financial institutions have to really step up and gear up to meet the quantum of investments that are needed to scale the business model, especially in emerging economies like India, where sectors like sustainable agriculture, climate smart water infrastructure, biodiversity conservation, both at fisheries and sustainable forestry levels. So these are all the emerging sectors, and financial institutions have to step up, come out with innovative financial mechanisms to bridge the funding gap. Second, it's generally perceived that banks they really have low consumption of natural capital, but their impact is far more due to the lending operations, right? So linking the biodiversity related scarcity risks to the business strategy serves really as an opportunity for financial institutions to identify, quantify, and evaluate the risks within their investment portfolios, and work with their clients to mitigate these risks. So all in all, in line with these thought process, Yes Bank, a leading private sector commercial institution based out of India, has really treated natural capital, climate change, biodiversity conservation at the focus of their business strategy. Now, we are guided by our ethos of responsible banking, and the bank, I'm proud to say, has been a pioneer in innovating products, processes, services backed by extensive research and strategic partnerships. I'll be taking you through all some of the things that we have done in the recent past and we are doing as we speak. Yes Bank has been the pioneer of the green bonds market here in India. We started way back in 2015 and created a market henceforth. What we did differently was we applied the natural capital protocols finance sector supplement on its green bonds. And why we really did that was to check the alignment of our green bonds with natural capital related concerns, and also to assess the impact and dependencies of our projects that are funded by these green bonds. Right, we've been able to strike some really strategic public-private partnerships here, along with the state governments in India, which are working towards increasing awareness and also mobilizing on-ground action to conserve critically endangered species like the one-horned rhino and the great Indian bustard. Since agriculture is a critical sector from an India perspective, Yes Bank has a specific business unit known as the Food and Agribusiness Strategic Advisory and Research, or FASAR as we call it. And this particular team really works along with government players and clients at all levels within the economy and help them shift towards climate smart agricultural technologies and biodiversity conservation projects. So that's like an advisory services. We advise to the governments. We also advise to the clients and how do they really leverage some of the great subsidies that are put in place and incorporate some of these concerns in their business strategy. Moving on, community engagement has been a core ethos at Yes Bank right since inception, and we really interact with the community around us on pertinent environmental and social issues. We have been able to touch base with thousands and thousands of farmers and really talk to them about the benefits of sustainable agriculture, while we are delivering them lectures on financial literacy and financial inclusion. So the twin objectives are really met through it. And not just the farmer community, we have developed experiential programs for the younger generation, which are imparted in the schools, which broadly cover the sustainable development goals and also have an aspect of natural capital conservations embedded into these programs. I'm very pleased to share one of the other product innovations where Yes Bank came out with India's first green retail liability product, which is a green future deposit. Like a usual future deposit, the only difference is that the proceeds are earmarked to really finance certain sustainable development goals, including biodiversity and natural capital conservation projects. What's also unique is that as a retail customer, when I book a green future deposit, a tree is planted under my name with a geotag location shared with me. And all this process is completely digitally controlled with no paper intervention and hence a green product. Moving on, India has a very special mandate to spend a certain amount of our profits on socially and environmentally relevant activities. This is regulated by the government. So we have really ensured that we use this fund, which is actually a derivative of our profits, to really create unique, scalable, and sustainable products and projects for towards biodiversity conservation. I'm really proud to share that we are working towards, as we speak, towards conservation of endangered and critically endangered species like the great Indian bustard or the house sparrows and the red panda, along with state governments. And these are very strategically taken projects which are backed by science-based research. They have got on-ground restoration of these habitats, reducing the man-animal conflict, and also making the nearby community aware about how can they reduce dependency on their natural capital, which is surrounding them, and sustainably use or rather extract them. That's a great project that we are doing that is working towards 4 species conservation. More than 57% of our rural population is really dependent upon forests for their livelihoods. And hence, Yes Bank realized that it's a critical focus area. We have, over the last 2 years, we have reached out to more than 20,000 farmers here in India. Again, we've been working towards building their capacity on sustainable agriculture practices, yet at the same time, we're ensuring that their livelihoods are maintained and restored, and there is no harm done to them. So essentially, I think some of the past speakers also said agriculture, farmers are an important community in this ambit of discussions, and Yes Bank is really serious about all of them, given that agriculture contributes a considerable amount to our GDP. Finally, Yes Bank had also become the first Indian private sector bank to really work towards greening of the highways. Now we are working with a national government agency to adopt a 40-kilometer stretch along a highway where we are going to maintain more than 45,000 trees over a period of 5 years, thereby creating a carbon sink. Now, it has been so all these initiatives and advocating for the right policies has been really on the back of knowledge and capacity building support and learning of the best practices that we have learned. I'm pleased to share that Yes Bank is the first and the only Indian signatory to Natural Capital Declaration, now formerly known as the Natural Capital Finance Alliance. We're also part of the Natural Capital Coalition, We have, of course, been working from last year as an informal working group member towards the task force for nature-related financial disclosures. And I think all these platforms are really leveraging the power of coalitions and partnerships to advance these important critical areas for us. On the back of these learnings, we have taken ambitious commitments during the Conference of Parties with a specific focus on creation of carbon sink in line with India's Paris Agreement targets. The bank last year has also been successfully accredited to the Green Climate Fund, and we really aim towards using this access of finance to really make changes in critical sectors, sunrise sectors of the economy, including natural capital and biodiversity conservation. A very unique property that Yes Bank has curated is the Natural Capital Awards. Now, this is really to identify, recognize, and reward corporates and individuals who are working in their day-to-day life and within their business strategies towards biodiversity conservation. And we've had successful 4 editions. And over these 4 editions, we've seen thousands of corporates and individual young heroes who've come forward, and we've rewarded them for their stories on biodiversity and natural capital conservation. I think all of my previous panelists have really shared about some intriguing reports that their organizations have done. Likewise, Yes Bank has also been publishing reports around natural capital. Yeah.
Sorry, I think we have to kind of wrap up now. So if you could do that.
Yes, this is the last slide. So I think the knowledge reports around natural capital mapping, where we've tried to establish the business case of natural capital and analysis in their business strategy. We've also seen at the contributions that SDGs and forests can make. And one of our recent reports that I'll be happy to talk about maybe in the questions would be about the impact of climate change on critical sectors like agriculture and natural ecosystems. So thanks a lot, and we look forward to further interactions.
Thank you, Anesh. And that may have raised a lot of questions. And so exactly, we want to have time for those questions. You're doing really a lot. And it's great to see in particular that you have your CSR money spent on biodiversity. We don't actually see that too much among companies. And I hope that other companies will be also inspired by your example. But right now, let us move to Colombia. We're going to hear next from Sandra Valenzuela, Director of Operations, Partnerships and Business Development of WWF Colombia. Sandra, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am pleased to talk and to change a little bit for another case study, so-called Heritage Colombia. That is an opportunity really to align financial flows with biodiversity, climate, and social objectives and goals. So we will see a little bit of how we have been designing a greater ambition and increasing domestic, private, international, and external financial mechanisms and different vehicles. So I think this is a very strong partnership to mobilize resources led by the Ministry of Environment, the Parks Authority, and a few civil society organizations. Thanks, you move to the second. So we saw the figures led by the Paulson Institute report and the OECD that recently are showing us a strong biodiversity financial gap. And as we were talking before, we have been trying to really push for climate integration into all different type of investment. And I think as we have been seeing the last loss of biodiversity and not only COVID situation, but this new global framework provide us really an opportunity to advance into the development and the integration of the biodiversity into all the different objectives and investments. So as we were working in the economic plan, we are really pushing as WWF to really kind of mainstreaming biodiversity in the different type of financial investments. Next. So going to Heritage Colombia as part of one of the case study called Herencia Colombia in Spanish, is a government-led initiative that aim really to restore and to maintain the health of the country, natural resources, as well as reducing the deforestation trends, prevent even damage in the future and loss of biodiversity. Is a multiple scale, is not only a protected area scale, but also a landscape scale that really is a combination into development over a secure of more than 20 million hectares, not only increasing coverage of protected areas, but also effective management, governance, and using the protected areas as a space for inclusion and peace building. So creating opportunities for well-being. So the idea, as I said, is not only working as a protected area basis, but also to promote corridors and landscape approach, and to develop productive alternatives based on natural resource management and restoration as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity, and use the services as a well-being factor. So Herencia Colombia, or ECO as we know it, is an initiative that works and promote conservation in Amazon, in the Andes, in the Orinoco, and the Pacific and the Caribbean. So it's a national-wide approach, and is a platform to ensure long-term financial sustainability. How we are doing that, to really creating and channeling financial flows from the public-private sector into really the specific objective. Next. So this is an example of the conservation goals that really links social goals, biodiversity goals, and climate goals, and we are really proud about that. And Heritage Colombia is really focusing on how to really achieve those plans and really mobilize the financial sustainability. So it's a robust conservation plan that really is aimed to really move farther and have a greater ambition for the country. Next. So that is based on a model that we call PFP, that is a project finance for permanence. What is permanence? Is to really maintain the protected areas for long term, but permanence really means to reduce the financial gap. So the PFP, or the Project for Permanence, as we call it, is a foundation to diversify public revenues, and building a stronger environment to attract more external investment, especially private investment, the private sector, and really promote community business enterprises in protected areas or within the corridors or in the landscape approach. So the structure for Herencia or Heritage Colombia requires NGOs, so all the civil society together, foundations, private donors, and of course led by our Ministry of Environment and Parks authorities, to really provide different type of funding to support kind of such an ambitious conservation plan. So what we are aiming is to sign the PFP as a single closing, what we call, to deliver different pledge of different type of funding when the conditions for permanence are met. And that is what the conditions for permanence are met when we have external funding sources, domestic funding sources, and the conservation plan that we have already into, and the possibility to motivate other parties or other sectors, and even the financial institutions to draw out of new revenues and commitments. And we are really close to do that. So the idea is that we are right now drafting these closing conditions and to launch Heritage Colombia as the national-wide financial strategy for protected areas in the coming month, and have the PFP schemes close to an end by the end of the calendar year. So the PFP schemes has been identified different government revenues. We will see in a little moment, disbursement milestones, and based on a financial model. Next. So we have been building that in alliance with Biofin as well. Biofin is leading us to do the gap analysis, the financial gap analysis for the National Protected System policy as a whole. And since Herencia Colombia is one of the most important financial mechanisms to finance the new policy on protected areas. So we are working to really how to reduce that gap. More or less in Colombia, there is an annual gap of 70 million. So what we need to really create the platform to reduce that financial gap from different type of instruments, and Herencia is one of these ones. Next. So Herencia is a 20 years program right now. As I said, because of the bigger scope, we are launching that by phases. So we are going to launch one of the first phases with a first financial close as the PFP for at least 200 million US dollars. So the PFP in Colombia brings into public and multilateral funding. So we were able to really align GEF projects, GCF that we are submitting in the next few months, and EU projects and others, and also to really adopt different domestic and financial mechanisms and have philanthropy and private donors into. So right now, as you can see in the graph, we have the target is to have 100 million donors for what we call international donors, that is philanthropy, private, and bilateral, multilateral. And we have a commitment from the government of 100 million to use for the next 10 years. So this will be our first phase for Herencia Colombia. And the idea is to really have an increasing of diversification of different funding sources. Next. So in order to do so, we are trying to really unlock other type of financial mechanisms. So not only relying on ODA, private funding, NGOs, and philanthropy, but also to really push for more domestic revenue schemes. So we have been doing a feasibility analysis for royalties, fees, permits, debt for conservation swaps, taxes and tariffs, concessional investments, and others. So we have the feasibility analysis is showing us that really if we're channeling those type of financial flows, we can really unlock $700,000 million. So that is really moving forward to address such a ambition goals. And also we are mobilizing different type of market-based approach with the private sector using payment for environmental services, RED, as a way of the protected areas really generating revenues, like more or less in the good terms, selling ecosystem services based on monetizable revenues and outcomes. And also looking for different policy incentives and other type of mechanisms. Recently, we have been developing a private sector strategy to decarbonize and have a more concrete investment into Heritage Colombia based on maybe offsets and different type of voluntary compensation mechanism. So that is kind of a whole combination. And the European Institute for Forest recently is engaged with Heritage Colombia to work with us in terms of the analysis of the financial flows to capitalize sector approach, because as you were seeing in terms of the targets, we can really channel investments in from transport, from commerce, from tourism sector, and from agricultural sector to really mainstream by the biodiversity into their investment intervention. Next. And as well, in trying to innovate and especially to really promote business, community business development and other type of bankable projects, we are trying to really push for a positive investment facility to support 3 types of services to return sinking financial institutions and ventures. That is quite new. So we are working with IDB, with the Paulson Institute and WCS and WWF, and looking for a small and medium enterprise facility to lower the cost of capital through grant basis and institutional de-risking, a project preparation facility to provide grants for grant capital in partnership with local financial institutions to really have kind of the bank into Heritage Colombia. And a third mechanism, it will be a technical assistance facility to provide grants or for grant capital to really have injections of small portions of capital for different business development. So this is kind of a whole integrated approach. And as well, with the IDB leadership, we are developing a digital platform to foster the financial and conservation and sustainable investment within Herencia. So the platform, it will be used with kind of different type of technologies and algorithms and so on, to have intelligent data and tools to connect government, investors, donors, impact investment, really to be as a platform for blended finance and project
Sandra?
investments. Next.
Sorry, Sandra, we have pretty much run out of our time if we want to have time for discussion.
Yes, I will
so
wrap.
Could you just wrap it up? Thank you.
Yes, sorry about that. And so that is only to show that as a matter of Herencia Colombia, as part of what we call Earth for Life initiative, we have been able to really unlock different type of mix of funding sources that make it possible this alignment of financial flows. And only to put it as a matter of conclusion next, the recent publication, Building Sustainable Finance for Resilient Protected Areas and Conserve, from Cumming and others, to that they raise 9 elements that for me are an opportunity to really align different type of financial mechanism. Thanks.
Thank you. And it's clear that there's so many different financing mechanisms out there that we can use for protected areas, and it's great that you're trying them. We're going to move now to the discussion part. So I would like to first go back to Arnesh. So our question says, your initiatives sound great. Have you done a biodiversity stress test on your bank's entire portfolio so that you know how much of it may still be causing harm to biodiversity, as well as the proportion that is clearly doing positive things? So Arnesh, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. So of course, we are learning as we're coming up the curve, and of course, availability of data and at times certain methodologies poses a challenge. So as of now, the answer is no, we have not done the stress testing of our entire portfolio as far as biodiversity risks are concerned. Having said that, we have very recently identified certain focus sectors that includes electricity generation from thermal sources, iron and steel, and commercial real estate, where we are going to do a stress testing. That's part of our larger targets under the climate risk testing as well. So having said that, Yes Bank has in place an environment and social policy, which is derived from Equator Principles and IFC performance standards. And through that, we are doing a due diligence of the projects, and of course includes a due diligence of the biodiversity related impacts and how you can really mitigate those impacts. I hope I was able to answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anas. And I have a second question for you. Can you please tell us more about how we can align finance with the Sustainable Development Goals and also combining this with our national biodiversity agendas? Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes. Thanks a lot, Ono, for that. And I think all my past speakers have really talked about it. And if I would have to summarize it from an Indian context very specifically, so in order to channelize finance towards sustainable development goals, biodiversity related targets, and in order to overcome the barriers and challenges of financing, I think there needs to be a complete evolution of the financial architecture that we are currently following. And this includes 3 important pieces. One is an enabling policy, The second is the disclosure frameworks, and third is at a governance level. I'm going to elaborate on it. So I think everybody really talked about today also about the importance of taxonomy, and hence from in India coming out with a common definition and a central policy is going to serve as a guideline for the financial sector to follow. In order to channelize finance towards SDGs and natural capital and biodiversity, I think it's very important to create either a specialized institute that takes up this mandate, a sort of a green financial institution altogether, or you mandate the existing financial institutions to take up very targeted approach towards financing. A case in point is the priority sector lending, which asks us to invest in renewable energy, a certain part of a portfolio into renewable energy. And I think that's how the finance could be scaled up. Now, thirdly, at an organizational level, we really need to recalibrate our risk management and governance frameworks, put in place certain board level committees to really look at this oversight and look at the financing and the impact of these sectors that's happening. Fourthly, it's very important to enhance our non-financial disclosures for transparency and accountability, right? Fast track implementation of task force for climate related financial disclosures. It's only 2 banks in India that are currently doing, as we speak, reporting on TCFD. More and more banks should really adopt the principles for responsible banking and proactive approaches like the stress testing, as we just discussed. And I think my final point is going to be on the climate literacy part, where there has to be an increased level of awareness, first of all, to take up really action, and their coalitions like UNEP-FI and TNFD and NCFA would play a role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anesh, and interesting to hear how you're combining both the climate and biodiversity challenge. It would be great to hear more about that, but we have short time here. Sandra, so I'm going to move back to you. So, seeing what you've been seeing on the ground with all the mechanisms that you're looking at, if you would translate that to what's happening at the global level, what do you think could be some appropriate resource mobilization targets for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework?
I think it will be a combination of, we have to work on a target on incentives, on subsidize, on harmful incentives or negative incentives to biodiversity. We need to have a kind of a target in terms of financial flows, and really a combination of public, domestic, external and international flows. Really have a target in terms of how to increase the international flows towards certain type of countries, and the integration of biodiversity into financial decisions and sectoral decisions. I think that is kind of 5 sets of targets. And I think we have been losing one, that is the cost sharing target, in terms of with communities and with others, in terms of really move for 5 or 6 set of targets. And that should be combined in the 3 main conventions, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate, and in terms of SDG agenda.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting the role of communities, and also to sort of quantify and qualify their contribution as important co-finance and co-benefits. That's really crucial. Garrett, I'm gonna move next to you. So you've mentioned already some interesting work with the private sector. What do you think are some of the innovative financing mechanisms countries can look into to achieve their resource mobilization targets?
Thank you very much, Ono. So let me talk a little bit about this example that we have about paying project developers to invest in adaptation. And I talk about adaptation because that's where we've been focusing this instrument. But listening to the conversation and so looking at the issues, I think that you can apply what we're doing for adaptation very easily to the concept of biodiversity. So the basic point is that the private sector doesn't invest in adaptation because it's not profitable to do so. And to think that the private sector will start to invest in adaptation if we don't make changes to the way that we provide finance, it's madness. You carry on doing the same thing and hope the result will change. So we really need to find ways that we can pay the private sector to engage in these activities. And the mechanism we've been working on at the African Development Bank is called the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. And we've learned a lot from the clean development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, but the two are very different. And here, I don't think we have time to get into it, but there are fundamental differences and issues around the concept of offsetting and market-based mechanisms and non-market-based mechanisms. And they alter the way that the private sector engages very substantially. So, you know, if you were a CDM skeptic and turned off by that whole experience, it doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't look at paying project developers to deliver adaptation benefits or biodiversity benefits. So very briefly, we start with the concept that it's a results-based payment instrument. So you only pay for the delivery of the results. So the project developer takes on the risk. You define the adaptation benefits that the project is going to deliver, and these are often very context specific, so they're different from different types of projects. And you find an off-taker who is willing to support that activity, and you negotiate with that off-taker a price that they are willing to pay and for how long they're willing to pay that price, and that's a critical point, so that you then provide enough finance for the project developer to overcome that financial barrier to investing in the project. So it's a concept of minimum concessionality. How much do you need to pay to help the private sector make this investment? And then you sign an offtake agreement with them. And with that offtake agreement, the private sector project developer could go to a local bank to borrow money, or they can attract equity investors to come in. You then implement the project, you do the monitoring, reporting, verification, and certification, and then the off-taker receives the certified adaptation benefit, and they report that as their contribution towards the adaptation goal of the Paris Agreement. And that is based on the commitments to provide support and receive support for adaptation that are enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Now, for all those things that I've said about adaptation, you could do the same thing for biodiversity. You've got the biodiversity assessment plans. Countries are saying what they need, what support they need for biodiversity. And if we were willing to pay the private sector to help deliver those things, then they could engage in genuine projects that deliver biodiversity requirements that countries have identified. And so this is very different from, I mean, it learns heavily from what we did with the carbon markets, but it's also very different. And maybe my final point, the willingness to pay for carbon during a 10-year period, it stimulated about 12,500 submitted projects under the CDM with a pipeline value of $430 billion. Now, even if we could do a fraction of that for adaptation and for biodiversity, then I think it's something worth looking at. And it all comes from that willingness to pay. And that's where governments need to step in and put in place sustainable long-term policies, regulations, legislation that raises, call it a biodiversity levy or an adaptation levy. And that's not such a strange idea, because actually we all pay for mitigation. We all pay for greenhouse gas emission reductions through our electricity tariffs, through our fuel subsidy, our petrol price at the pump, and through the goods and services that we buy, and things like the EU emissions trading scheme. So paying for adaptation and biodiversity is not such a wacky idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Garrett. So you made a very strong case that if we want to be successful in climate change adaptation, we have to do some financial adaptation and try new models. That's very interesting. And I think you also already explained a bit more about how to pay the private sector. There was a question on that. But we hope to stay with you for one more question, and here it is. Rather than pay private sector for biodiversity outcomes, should we not have a system that raises their green credentials, thus giving them access to finance and access to markets for their goods and services?
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, I agree. I think there's many different tools that we should use, and definitely raising the green credentials of organizations so they can have better access to finance is a critical step. And I mean, it's the same as we're doing with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, where companies should disclose and declare their environmental and biodiversity risks and so on. And it would be very interesting to to understand how corporations' supply chains are susceptible or reliant on biodiversity, and the loss or the impact that the loss of biodiversity could have on business models. And definitely that would raise awareness. I think that at the minute, probably the financial sector, the institutional investors are focused on getting carbon out of their project portfolios. So you see steps towards disinvesting or divesting from coal-fired projects and oil-fired assets and so on. So I'm not sure how many different parameters the institutional investors are able to take on at one time. But I think there's definitely no harm in seeing the financial sector improving the transparency and the declaration of the kinds of risks that they are facing, because for sure we are increasingly learning that the more we understand and manage these kinds of risks, the more valuable our companies and corporations are, and the less vulnerable they are to the range of impacts that we are now experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you, and indeed that brings us also back to the challenge of having many different priorities and merging the climate and biodiversity agendas, and some really interesting examples. Thank you so much. So we've almost come to the end of our discussion. There's been a lot of chats about biodiversity offset, and Sandra, I was just wondering if you could give us a bit of your perspective. You mentioned biodiversity offsets being one of the mechanisms that you're looking at. Is there anything you can say about your experience in Colombia and the offsets that can enlighten our participants?
This is part of the thinking and developing how we can really use the bio-offset mechanism in a proper way. So we are, and it's part of the designing the strategy with the corporate sector in terms of defining different set of portfolio of investment in terms of meeting their targets in terms of decarbonization, and meeting the target in investing in heritage Colombia landscapes and corridors. So that is part of the mechanism that we are using and promoting as an offset in terms of the behalf of the conservation and deforestation trends and social well-being. And that is part of the developing that we are doing in this moment with a few partners.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think one of the principles that should always stand is indeed the mitigation hierarchy comes first when looking at offsets, and offsets is only the end game of the mitigation hierarchy, and it should not be presented as the kind of starting point. And so it's a really important topic, especially if a lot of enterprise and governments are increasingly adopting no net loss targets, and banks are screening their portfolio. They're gonna, in one way or the other, look at offsets. So it's an important dialogue that we have to keep going. And thanks for those who contributed. I saw contributions from OECD and TNC and others in the chat. That's very, very welcome. So I think I'm going to soon hand over for the wrap up. So I think this was a very interesting discussion. Just one thing that I want to share is I think we've seen a lot of discussion about the finance sector. And I think the reason for that is that we feel strongly that if we want to be successful, we must work strongly with the finance sector, and we must scale up the work with the finance sector. That doesn't replace the work that we're doing, for example, on protected areas, as was presented by Sandra. These will remain the bedrock of our work, but I think the data that has been presented at the beginning of this webinar has clearly made the case that we cannot do that alone. We have to work in the agriculture sector, we have to work on fisheries, and we have to work with the finance sector to really be able to reach our biodiversity targets by 2030. And so we've come to the end of this second part. I want to thank again the three panelists. We have seen amazing examples from around the world. And these are all food for thought. And we're going to hear now actually from Ines Verleijen and Basil van Havre, who are chairing the Resource Mobilization Group, co-chair of the Resource Mobilization Group and former co-chair of the Resource Mobilization workshop done by the CBD last year. They are going to share some reflections and insights, and they're going to also tell us how are we going to take all these ideas forward? How should the CBD look at this, and how should the CBD change their global strategy and engagement? What are some of the takeaways that we can still look at before the COP? So I think, Ines, I'm going to first go over to you, and then Basil.
Yes, thank you very much, Onno. And thank you also for everybody who's organizing this and for those that are participating, because this is a very important moment to share ideas. It's an extremely complex issue, and this has been a very rich and very useful exchange of views. And in my view, both for the development of the framework and for its implementation. So I would like to raise just a few points based on what I've heard. First is it shows that thanks to all the presentations, it really shows that despite the enormity of the challenge that we are facing on resource mobilization for biodiversity and trying to change the way things are being done, turn this tanker around, there are a lot of options, there are a lot of potential solutions if there is enough political will, if there is enough knowledge about the advantages, the social, the economic, and the ecological advantages. So it's important to look at those, but it needs, and that is also, that came out from several of the presentations, it will require a collaboration among all different actors, public, private, local, national, international. And I think that's also why it's going to be very important to look at the whole resource mobilization aspect within the framework as a complex issue. It's not just mobilizing flows, or it's not just asking for international finance or for domestic finance. It's a combination. And it's important that it's reflected in the targets. So I would think that we still have to start that discussion, but it's very important to take what has been shared and what has been developed and what is available and bring that into the discussions. There is a need to look at what Sandra also said. It's important to look at a set of targets that address the different, the global, the national, the public, the private, the stakeholders. All of that needs to be captured somehow, because it is so complex. And I know we're short for time, so I just want to make one more point, and that is that if you look at what the Paulson report has produced, there's this famous graph where you see the need to reduce the bad and increase the good. But that will require a mixture of funding sources and alignment of budgeting. And I was very happy to see that slide also in the presentation from Colombia, that it shows that this needs to be embedded both in policy reforms and in innovative ideas. And there needs to be continuity. We all know that everything in that graph will depend on national decisions. In the end, it's all about land management, land use, and national decisions, whether they are then extrapolated to the global and the international actions, or whether they are translated down to the local level. So to me, the national finance plans will be crucial, not just for the domestic resource mobilization, but also for the international. And that was also very nicely shown in that graph, that one of the big things that is being put forward all the time is that it needs to be demand driven, it needs to be good for the country, it needs to be fitting within the sustainable development. The national biodiversity finance plans can do that based on the national realities, develop or propose financing solutions, and then those can address international solutions, national solutions, etc. So to me, that continuity, that continuum needs to be also reflected somehow in the framework to allow for all the partners to work together. But thanks again for this, and I try to keep it short. Thank you.
Basil, you're muted.
That's why I was frozen. So now, can you see me now and hear me? Yes. Thank you. What an interesting string of presentation, and I will go through the keynotes I took in my book as we worked through the 2 hour plus. We started with roles, and looking at the enormity of the task in front of us, which is daunting a little bit. And yet, the possibility of the solution, they are there. Like, we should not be frightened by that. And then we went to Jenny, and Jenny talked to us about getting into detail, and was struck by that that graph about making the investment green, and that's a very interesting. And I'll come back to that. And then we went on to Gilles, and one of the thing I've noted in Gilles' remark is the SBI debate is not anywhere where it should be. The SBI debate is very much about the very, very small ODA category. And that is worrying for me. And I think what we're doing today is bringing that debate where it should be. And that's a very important part. So I'm a little bit worried. I want to thank the organizers, because they're doing exactly what we need, and we need a lot more than that. Of that. Then we went on to the private sector, and Garrett, this is the first time I hear you, and I hope I will continue to hear you very often, because I really appreciate what you're bringing to the discussion. And what you're bringing to the discussion is that notion that we need to create the incentive and the environment that enable private sector to do what they do, which is to invest, make money, and then make money in a context that is nature positive. Nothing wrong with that. And then Sandra, I think we all have been hearing about this approach in Colombia, and that has been very useful to get the detail. And I know we're going to get the PowerPoint presentation later, and we're looking forward to that. But this is an example about how, at the national level, like Ines was said a minute ago, we need national approaches, we need national plans adapted to the circumstances of each country. But at the end of the day, they need to work. So through the chat, I took the liberty to ask my own question to the group early in the process. Apologies to the organizers, I seldom follow the rules. But you've provided me with the answer in terms of we need to reflect that. And then one of the questions from Ono is, what do we make with all that information? And I'm looking forward to see what the parties are going to tell us in terms of redrafting the next negotiation draft. I have some ideas on how we can frame the various dimensions in terms of addressing the rest of the equation. I will admit that the current draft is not very good at reflecting the discussion we had today. We need specifics on the redirecting negative and repurposing negative incentive, etc. But there are some really good ideas. I'm looking forward to the debate. I got a clear sense from you that you would want in an all-inclusive type of approach, and that may be very useful. So thank you very much to all of you, to all the panelists. Thank you very much to all the people that participate in asking questions and in the chat. I think those very, very useful. And I'm looking forward to the continued work in terms of your comments when we come down to the actual session. Oh no, back to you.
Thank you. And I actually just pass over to DJ instead, I think, for very final remarks to close the event.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I heard from Basil that this webinar is useful for the co-chairs. I hope it's also useful for the whole negotiation, and I hope that a lot of negotiators and representatives from parties are still in the participants. So I just want to thank you all, the interpreters, the panelists, and all the participants for your question, your remarks, and all things. So it was really I think amazing discussion also with the constraint of this kind of meetings, but this is how we need to work actually. I just want to remind you that you will receive tomorrow information, so links with the different PowerPoint presentation, and also it's important for our project a survey, and I hope that you will take time to complete it. It's really important for us, and it's also important to prepare the next webinar. So we will organize another webinar in 2 weeks, the 13th of April, on another crucial issue for the global biodiversity framework. So it's on transforming agro-food system for sustainable development and biodiversity. So with all that, I think we are on time. So it's marvelous. So thanks all of you, Ono especially for moderate this webinar, all the panelists, and of course Ines and Basil. So with that, I say goodbye and good afternoon, night, or day. Bye-bye.
Right, thank you.
Bye.